I'm Kristen Chrisman, and this is part 6 of 6. I've been reading the essay Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, Trapped in a Cultural Script, which I wrote April 10th, and it's online on countercurrents.org. What I'm saying is almost the same thing. I've tweaked it a little bit and added some things and clarified a few things. And all the endnotes are on countercurrents.org, all the sources. We've been talking about the cultural script that we are dangerously taking part in. It's a fictional script, but belief in the script is what's dangerous. The script is that there's an innocent victim, Ukraine, fighting an evil persecutor, Russia, and that we've got these rescuing heroes, U.S., other NATO, other nations. The extreme danger of believing in this script is that those who believe they are good guys blind themselves to the evil of their own hatred, of their own punishment, of their actions, and of their own violence that they inflict upon the ones they consider evil. And so I'm showing how the script is being formed. This very last section talks about double standards. That's another way in which the script is supported. A way to show that Ukraine and the U.S. are good and Russia is bad is to have double standards. This is, I'll be reading sections 7 and 8 from my essay, and this is called Double Standards. To fortify the script of good versus evil even further, double standards abound and multiply, like rabbits in springtime. Both Russia and the U.S. have invaded nations, but according to double standard morality, Russia's invasions are motivated by belligerence, never legitimate fears, while U.S. invasions are motivated by legitimate fears, never belligerence. Same behavior, different judgment. In fact, to doubt this double standard is sacrilegious to those who think of American patriotism as a religion. Putin's past condemnations of the obsessive and ongoing hyper-use of force by the United States are deemed unreasonable and inappropriate. But Biden's indignant shock and condemnation of Putin's use of war are respected as wise. Similarly, Russian military exercises are ominous and malicious. Yet U.S. and NATO joint military collaboration with Ukrainian forces is well-intentioned and benevolent. And U.S. and NATO nations' arming of Ukraine with billions in surveillance systems, Humvees, missiles, and drones is only sensible and decent. Russia's taking back Crimea is described as a belligerent invasion. Russia claims there was no invasion, but a referendum in which the largely Russian population voted to rejoin Russia, with whom it had existed until 1954, when it was attached to Ukraine. Putin's motivating concern about losing the naval base on the Black Sea to the creeping East NATO is another fear erased from media discussion, because fear, once again, would make Russia seem less evil and more understandable. Yet U.S. insistence that it will never, ever recognize the Crimea as part of Russia suggests an unusual preoccupation, frankly, with wanting Crimea for itself, for NATO, and for companies like ExxonMobil. Moreover, according to investigative historian Eric Zuss, a key goal of the 2014 coup, which was supported by the Obama administration, was precisely to replace Russia's naval base on the Black Sea with a U.S. naval base. But we're supposed to all be in denial about that. Of course, if the U.S. succeeds in its plot to topple Putin, it will install a leader who will give it the access it wants to the Black Sea. You can be sure of that. And you can be sure it won't be portrayed as acquisitive or greedy, but just and fair. Double standards also pertain to information and trust. American groupthink, inflated by its self-righteous role in the script, and seeming to borrow from middle school dynamics, social dynamics, jeers and smears Putin's every word as absurd and staged, despite the intelligent observations in his remarks. Despite the fact that the intelligence and perceptiveness conveyed in his essay far surpass the shallow logic and simplistic jingoist patriotism that passes for intelligence in the statements of our U.S. policymakers. Just compare Putin's essay to Bush Jr.'s 2006 national security strategy. But Putin is portrayed as unhinged, and Biden, meanwhile, we're expected to trust as caring, unconcealing, so honest that he's thinking out loud and holding out the olive branch, with no stage management or image control whatsoever. No proof is needed for us to believe, just faith in the script. The double standards get even more sickening. Headlines scream of slaughter and savage Russian war crimes. TV reporters interview sobbing Ukrainians. Yet U.S., NATO, and Ukrainian war crimes are barely publicized, their victims ignored. Same actions, different judgment. This double standard on sympathy is particularly nauseating, yet inescapable. Websites and social media have pop-up notices asking for help for suffering Ukrainians. Sitting in the waiting rooms of medical offices, you can hear TV news stations interviewing frightened Ukrainians. You hear U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken trying to sound moral and dignified in his denunciation of Russia's invasion, despite his own history of advocating the illegal and immoral invasion of Iraq as a form of tough diplomacy which has killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, and despite his history of supporting Saudi Arabia's invasion of Yemen, which has brought about another humanitarian disaster. Of course, Blinken's private interests are with West Exec Advisors, which helps bridge connections between the U.S. Defense Department and information technology companies such as Google and Amazon, in order to help with violent programs such as drone warfare. So he would tend to not see the double standards as double standards. Perhaps he would see the invasions of Iraq and Yemen not so much as invasions, but as examples of the problem-solving skills the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan claimed Americans uniquely possess. I talked about Jake Sullivan's beliefs in an earlier essay about U.S. greed and biases. So we're inundated with stories of grief and sympathy online, in the media, and at the dentist's office on TV. Even the grocery stores interrupt their songs on speakers to proudly announce plans to help the suffering Ukrainians. But why weren't grocery stores and websites concerned about suffering Iraqis and Afghans, to name a few victims of U.S. invasions? Why no public announcements of supplies being shipped to help the tortured and unlawfully detained at Guantanamo, Camp Bucca, Camp Cropper, or Abu Ghraib? Are we supposed to cut off our hearts' feelings because the U.S. government says so? Are our hearts turned on and off by the government? Does government own our hearts and minds? Why are victims of Russian violence innocent and worthy of sympathy, but victims of U.S. government violence are rarely worth mentioning at all, as if they deserve to suffer? Were they just evil people who had to die because U.S. policymakers knew what was best for the world? It's repulsive. Upon hearing the grocery store announcement demonstrating sympathy for Ukrainians, I couldn't help but call out, "Oh, shut up." Why? Because it's not truly sympathy. Maybe the specific Americans who feel sympathy and love, people who care about Ukrainians or have friends and families in Ukrainians, just like they might have friends and families in Russia, and they truly care. But this propaganda that we're receiving, that's not truly sympathy. This isn't love, it's hypocrisy. It's a political game. It's like asking us to kneel before people dressed up as benevolent moral priests before they go in the back room to secretly abuse boys. If this were truly sympathy, truly love and caring, we'd be hearing sympathy for those who suffer from U.S. invasions. It wouldn't be 180-degree sympathy for one side only. It'd be 360-degree sympathy. What's more, if it were truly sympathy, we'd be ensuring that the U.S. government was not killing anyone, whether through invasions, drones, weapon shipments, sanctions, or unfair terms of business and trade. Why are we stooping so low as to give the U.S. government the right to tell us whom to love, whom to hate, whom to aid, and whom to kill? The U.S. government does not have this right. No government has this right. Why is the entire nation like a giant beehive where everyone must support the Queen and proclaim her messages without having hearts and minds of their own? It's a really hideous feeling living in the psychological climate of Orwellian doublethink and herd groupthink, as if they're trying to suck out our hearts, brains, and souls. The public announcements over the speakers make it all so jarring, so fraudulent. How different the United States is from the benevolent democracy we falsely learned that it was as children. When sympathy for the suffering is merely based upon U.S. government's opportunistic decisions, its selfish decisions, about allies and enemies, that's not truly love. It's fake. It's really only blind allegiance to the U.S. government and those whom serve the U.S. government's purposes. Do you know what's revolting? During the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq, independent journalists reported that U.S. troops in Fallujah took over a hospital and wouldn't allow Iraqis to get care. U.S. troops fired at ambulances and killed hundreds of civilians. An endless current of women and children shot by U.S. snipers were racing to the emergency clinic. Throughout Iraq, thousands of private U.S. military contractors could kill Iraqis at will with immunity and impunity, enraging Iraqis and never held accountable. It's revolting it happened, and it's revolting that you won't see a thing about that on a front or back page in mainstream media. You have to read Jeremy Scahill's Blackwater. The U.S. bombed Iraq's water supply, and the water went foul, making people sick. U.S. troops used dogs to scare little children, telling them the dogs would bite if the children cried. U.S. troops broke into families' homes at night, terrifying them, forcing the men to all lie down on the floor, even holding a gun to a praying grandmother's head. Children didn't even go to sleep at night, preferring to at least be awake for the next time U.S. troops would barge in again and start yelling and waving their guns about. But you won't see that in the news. You have to read Deborah Ellis's Children of War, Voices of Iraqi Refugees, to learn that. During the Persian Gulf War, 1991, the U.S. attacked the retreating Iraqi army, napalmed and fuel air-bombed Iraqi troops to deprive them of oxygen, and bulldozed over the Iraqi troops, dead and alive, in miles of trenches. The U.S. bombed the nuclear facilities. But you'd have to read Triumph of the Image, a third world perspective, edited by Hamid Maulana, George Gerbner, and Herbert Schiller, to learn that. The U.S. military bombed infrastructure, water treatment plants, power plants, fertilizer plants, food warehouses, hospitals, bridges, irrigation systems, civil buildings, transportation networks, and oil refineries. Tens of thousands of Iraqis died after the war because of the destruction to the infrastructure from these bombings. Women, out of stress, lost their unborn babies. Women, out of stress, were unable to nurse their babies. But you won't hear that on mainstream media. You'll just read words of jubilation over the carnage. For the suffering, you have to read Zahra Ali's Women and Gender in Iraq. During the sanctions, pump parts couldn't be replaced, causing sewage to spill everywhere, causing typhoid and dysentery to reach epidemic proportions. People had no electricity, no food. People were forced to eat bread made from flour mixed with sawdust. People died from lack of medication, no longer available because of sanctions. Large numbers of livestock died. People became severely depressed, but you won't read that in mainstream media. You have to read Ellis's Children of Iraq. We could go on with examples. During the Korean War, the U.S. Air Force, with no opposing Air Force, leisurely carpet-bombed street after street of neighborhoods in North Korea, destroying 3/4 of residences and more than half the majority of cities. The U.S. dropped napalm on civilians, cities, and countryside. It bombed irrigation dams, which caused flooding, washed out villages, destroyed rice crops, and caused mass starvation. Another U.S. war crime unannounced. You know you won't read that in mainstream U.S. media, where North Korea is only evil. You have to read Blaine Harden's The Great Leader and the Fighter Pilot. Before the U.S. government takes the beam out of Russia's eye, it had better extract the giant mass of sewage and putrid waste in its own eye. The U.S. government has no basis upon which to judge other nations when it refuses to heed the condemnation of the International Criminal Court, and when it refuses to even join the ICC because it arrogantly wants veto power over all the other nations' voices. If other nations wish to judge Russia's actions, nations who actually abide by international law themselves, that's fine. They can evaluate Russia's provocations, motivations, reactions, and options, as long as they're not being bribed and intimidated by U.S. policymakers. Otherwise, the U.S. government is behaving like a slick, polished, pompous gentleman, indignant over the crime he sees in the streets. It's silent about the hitmen he's been paying for years to kill targets, bomb villages, and secretly bury corpses. If the U.S. government routinely condemned itself for its violence, if it genuinely tried to reform its foreign policies, curb its weaponry, muffle its greed, then I'd be open to being more horrified about what Russia is doing. But frankly, I'm too shocked and unsettled by the two-faced morality. The U.S. government wants us to care about Ukrainians only to be pawns in its little game against Russia. And if U.S. policymakers and media makers are going to tell me to cry over Ukrainians but not shed a tear over Afghans, well, I'm not going to oblige them. Because the truth is, the U.S. doesn't care about any of them. If the U.S. really cared about Ukrainians, it would have been much more careful about not provoking Russia in the first place, not supporting an undemocratic coup, and not letting Ukraine get into the current state it's in. It would have supported non-violent conflict resolution rather than send weapons, billions of dollars of weapons, to escalate a civil war. If the U.S. government really cared about Afghans back in 1979, who I mentioned in the first video, it never would have armed one side to kill the other and to bait the USSR to invade. It would have used its wealth and talent to help resolve the largely economic conflict at the root of Afghanistan's civil war. And if the U.S. government had really cared about Americans, it wouldn't have sent U.S. troops to their deaths. And it would have been much more careful about not provoking so many enemies around the world who abhor Americans because of our government's stupid, greedy, hostile policies. We can't even travel abroad without fear of being targeted as Americans. What kind of freedom is that? But if the U.S. government really cares about making profits from weapon sales and new foreign acquisitions, then it's going to keep doing what it's doing, sending weapons and not solving the roots of conflict. The double standards never end. Biden, seemingly judicious, seeks to place Putin on trial for war crimes. It's one step closer to ousting Putin and replacing him with what is euphemistically called a pro-U.S. leader. A pro-U.S. leader is nothing more than a leader of low morals who will sell out his country to please U.S. policymakers and businessmen, whether by enhancing their personal fortunes or the fortunes of select U.S. businessmen, giving away businesses and resources at low prices to U.S. businessmen, sending his military wherever the U.S. wants, hosting U.S. military bases and U.S. nukes, and voting however the U.S. wants at the UN, IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and World Bank. If Biden is so judicious, why doesn't he suggest war crimes trials for all living U.S. presidents? Have the statutes of limitations passed? Or isn't he really bothered by war crimes, but he's using them as a pretext to try to oust Putin? Or is he afraid he'll get charged with crimes too? But seriously, let's put U.S. presidents on trial for the horrors they've inflicted with invasions, drone killings, kidnappings, torture, mining harbors, selling weapons, and collaborating with death squads and warlords in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Somalia, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Panama, to name only a few. Why not hold U.S. presidents accountable for violating the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty by deploying nukes in 5 non-nuclear powers in Europe and revitalizing the U.S. nuclear arsenal rather than dismantling it? The U.S. says it's not violating the treaty because U.S. personnel are in charge of the nukes abroad. In other words, the U.S. government could put nukes in every country all around the world, and according to their logic, as long as a few U.S. personnel are there in charge of the nukes, this is not considered nuclear proliferation. To have nukes all around the world, as long as you have a couple of Americans there. I'm sure the nuclear industry CEOs have a lot to do with that definition. Exactly why doesn't Biden hold these presidents accountable for violating both international law and congressional law? Why a merely momentary scandal and no justice, just pardons? Why, when it comes to presidential crimes, are we supposed to be moving forward and not stuck in the past? It's something ordinary Americans never hear at their own trials for their never pardonable alleged crimes. Why are U.S. presidents and their friends treated as being above the law, as deities who can kill whom they please with impunity? And it's not that they're putting U.S. presidents above other national leaders, such as Putin. They're putting U.S. presidents above other Americans. Are we expected to look up to this class as holier than us? Are we expected to be grateful they're not held accountable for their crimes because they're such wonderful, distinguished Americans, while we're all losers who deserve every punch we get? What kind of fraudulent democracy is this? And Americans are supposed to believe in elections as indicative of democracy? They just bring in more of the same. The same pardons, privileged circles, trampling of foreigners, and kleptocratic use of taxes to make government serve our leaders and their circles' personal business interests. When I condemn U.S. presidents, I'm not a traitor. I'm pointing out that those U.S. presidents are traitors. They're traitors to the American people and to what this country was supposed to stand for. And everybody who stands up for them and refuses to put them on trial, they are also traitors. Those, like Biden, who call for a trial of the Russian leader, but not of U.S. presidents, aren't supporting justice at all, but injustice. They're using the law when it suits them as sort of a dress-up costume to look gallant, and then dispensing with it when they wish for themselves and their allies to violate it with impunity and run around in their underwear. Upholders of true international justice would understand that violent enemy actions don't occur out of the blue. Most enemies are not motivated by malice and evil. Most have grievances. While there's no excuse for violence, there's also no excuse for failing to attend to the injustices and fears that lead a nation to behave with violence. Humanity and justice require that we have 360-degree empathy and understanding for all sides of conflict. However, since the fictitious script of evil persecutor, innocent victim, and rescuing hero would never hold up in an unbiased courtroom, the U.S. government has its own system of international justice. Instead of supporting the International Criminal Court, the U.S. government and its cohort, mainstream media, hold court through the media. Acting as prosecutor, judge, and executioner at once, the U.S. government and its propaganda arm have sentenced thousands of Mideasterners without a defense attorney, charges, jury, judge, or trial to prison, torture, and death in the war on terror. It's the same court that has pardoned or simply ignored the crimes of U.S. presidents and high officials. And it's the same court that condemns Putin's every word as false and every move as illegal and malicious. In their pseudo-court of the front pages, policymakers and media makers feel right at home, falling into habits of half-truths and script promotion. Their own side of conflict is invariably angelic, and the other side is both condemned and punished as demonic. Instead of an impartial analysis of conflict, facts are molded to fit the cultural script. In this pseudo-court, Putin's wish to protect Donetsk and Lugansk, self-declared republics since 2014, and end Kiev's 8-year war that has killed 14,000, is automatically mocked as false pretext for conquest. Yet U.S. wishes to protect Ukraine from Russia are trusted as purely caring without ulterior design. The role of private military contractors, NATO, and the U.S. in escalating civil war and provoking Russia by arming Ukraine with billions in weapons since 2014, rather than committing to non-violently resolve Ukraine's internal conflict, remains unassessed. Why? Isn't provoking and escalating violence a crime? Who paid for the billions in weapons? U.S. taxpayers? Ukrainian taxpayers? Either way, it was people who had no voice in the decision to make the purchase. Russia's claims that Kiev cut off utilities, including water, to the republics, and would not allow Russia to send humanitarian aid, are similarly unexamined, even though articles from German and British news sources report on Ukraine's attacks in 2014 that damaged a power plant in Donetsk, thus cutting off access to water, and on Ukraine's cutting off the electricity supply and funding to the republics in 2017. None of these humanitarian matters made front pages either. It wasn't convenient for the script, because it threatens the image of Ukraine's innocence and Russia's evil. The fact that U.S. policymakers accurately predicted that Putin would use the civil war as a reason for invasion is somehow supposed to imply that therefore they proved his motivation false, when actually they did not prove it false. They only logically figured out that the civil war would provoke Russia. Of course, if they knew it would provoke Russia, why didn't they stop sending arms to Ukraine and try harder to resolve the civil war in the first place? Why aren't they held responsible for this? Silly question. The answer? Those in charge of holding them responsible are all part of the same corrupt system. It's the same pseudo-court that pardons presidents. But it makes you wonder, who really wanted that civil war anyway? Ukrainians, who actually have to suffer through it? Or U.S. policymakers who relax thousands of miles away in safety? This is the last section, Section 8, Consequences of Believing the Script. What are the consequences of believing in this persecutor, victim, and hero drama? Of believing in this script of good versus evil? Once evil is equated with enemies, it becomes deceptively simple for heroes, quote, heroes, to champion goodness, bomb enemies into submission, impose deadly sanctions, strangulate funding, send weapons, engineer coups. But none of these methods nurture goodness. Instead, they nurture injustice and cruelty. The truth is, those convinced they're fighting evil are frequently blinded to the immorality and injustice of their own actions against people who aren't so evil after all. I'm going to read that again. The truth is, those convinced they're fighting evil are frequently blinded to the immorality and injustice of their own actions against people who aren't so evil after all. I really want to hammer that point in. U.S. policymakers, gripped by talons of determination to bring freedom and light abroad and to banish evil, have invaded nations of the Mideast. For what? To usher in decades of despair and atrocities. U.S. policymakers, in the clutches of fervent, obsessive anti-communism combined with greed, have toppled foreign leaders in multiple nations abroad. For what? To ignite decades of torture, executions, and disappearances under U.S.-supported right-wing tyrants, particularly in Latin America. Mesmerized by dreamy convictions of divinely ordained expansion across the North American continent, by a belief in the goodness of Western civilization and technology, U.S. policymakers have exterminated, culturally crippled, and spiritually ruined Native Americans, tribes, multiple species of life, and the health of the land, air, and water. U.S. policymakers can't seem to shake a dangerous psychological combination. A genuine exaggerated fears of foreigners. A pseudo-religious obsessive belief in America's ability to create a better world. And underlying motives of greed, which in their minds they justify as benefiting the world, not only themselves. So you've got fears, exaggerated fears, combined with these pseudo-religious morality beliefs, and noble aspirations mixed in with that, combined with greed. And this script, the noble hero rescuing the innocent victim against the evil persecutor, holds their illogic, their noble dreams and aspirations, their cruel policies, and their propaganda together like glue. Observing the script inflicts even further damage. But believing the script inflicts even further damage. The U.S. habitually uses exaggerated fears of evil enemies, not to actually reduce evil in the world, but as false justification for colossal military budgets. NATO expansion, more military bases, troops, weapons, and nukes, all of which pour gasoline on the world tinderbox of tension, drain desperately needed funding, and fail to resolve conflict. In a way, the U.S. military budget acts as sanctions against the American people, because the enormous drain on funding cuts us off from our potential to fund and experience aspects of life outside of war. Remember, it's the military budget, it's more than $750 billion in 1 year. And it's going to be more next year. It's always more, even though it never works. Where's the evaluation of it? Where's the evaluation of the impact of weapons? Where's the social impact statements? Who's proving that these weapons are helping? Who's proving that these wars are... Are there any surveys of conflict participants? Of victims of the conflict? There's no evaluation. Another consequence of the script is the wearying psychological effect on the mind. The disgust at belonging to a nation that is so cruel to others, so proud and so false, and not being able to do a thing about it. This essay, for instance, will come and go, but nothing will change. It's disheartening at best. The good versus evil script has yet further ramifications. It enables the, quote, innocent to get away with all they've done to exacerbate conflict. It gives them a free pass to pull off the same stunt on another nation and another. The script can even enable the innocent, including neoconservatives and liberal hawks, now united in Biden's administration, to slickly seize power, resources, and markets from those deemed evil. U.S. leaders' promotion of this good versus evil storyline appears compassionate, but it isn't against killing. It isn't about justice. It's about pushing a script that provides pretext for injustice and violence on the part of those proclaiming their own goodness. U.S. policymakers, it seems, were never so happy about Russia as when the USSR dissolved in 1991 and came under the economic attack of greedy Russian, American, and other foreign predators, eager to acquire Russia's resources and markets for themselves, now that communism no longer held them back. The real reason U.S. policymakers hated communism became all too clear. It was cloaked in morality, but it was about greed. And it was about something more than that, I think. A pseudo-search, perhaps for personal worth or for national self-esteem. It can be self-hatred that drives people to believe in these fictional scripts, in which they see themselves as innocent victims or rescuing heroes. Policymakers and media makers deceived others and perhaps themselves. Judging people as evil and then hating and killing them is a quick, sloppy, and selfish way for some people to prove their own worth, to assure their own merit as being on the side of goodness. After all, they just killed evil. But there are better, truer ways to prove one's goodness and worth. The first step is to scrap the script and view this conflict impartially. It is not a case of innocent Ukraine and noble US and NATO versus evil Russia. Each member in the cast has both positive and negative motivations. Some good features, some bad features. Perhaps not in equal amounts, but they're there in different ways. Americans, like Russians, deserve to know this. We all deserve accurate, sophisticated information about conflict. We don't need one-sided propaganda that teaches us to hate one another, or that makes us roll our eyes with sarcasm over what we're supposed to believe. We don't need a good guy script to make us feel good about ourselves. Actually, it just makes us feel false. We, policymakers, media makers, and civilians alike, we need the full truth to help us find understanding, to compassionately release the grip of greed and rivalry, and to pursue nonviolent pathways. They're there. They're not hard. To peace, friendship, and a caring form of justice. Why are our leaders so scared of this? Why do they fear revealing the positive and negative motivations of both sides of conflict? Are they afraid they'll get hurt if we don't believe the script? Do they honestly see the script as real? Has the social inbreeding of these business circles led to minds incapable of seeing clearly? Or do they fervently want to see themselves as good? Is there a way for them to feel good that does not require their sacrificing the truth? Can they find a better way to be heroes? Can they try much harder and without taking sides in foreign conflicts to actually be the way that Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, falsely claims Americans already are? At heart, none of us, whether we're American, Russian, or Ukrainian, are helped by pseudo-justice that is distributed falsely on the pages of government propaganda and fired with heartless impunity from drones. At heart, none of us benefit from a ridiculous, dangerous script that reads like a fairy tale with evil ogres and innocent little children. We need justice that is based upon a courageous look at the full truth and deep understanding. We need understanding that is guided by the genuine wish to help one another, to kick the habit of propaganda, to ground irrational fears of bad guys, to cure the sickness of greed, to dislodge false and dysfunctional notions about personal worth and success, to improve our lives, minds, hearts, and spirits, and to demonstrate caring and friendship, not just for those falsely deemed innocent, heroic, and good, but for all of us, with 360 degrees of empathy all the way around the world. Thank you. And that concludes the 6 parts of this essay, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, Trapped in a Cultural Script. The full essay, which is almost identical to what I read, is on countercurrents.org. Thank you very, very much. And thank you to my co-star Angel. She's on her doggy sofa there. And she helped a lot. I've been working and researching and writing on peace for 20 years, since 9/11, with Angel, with her peaceful spirit helping me. Thank you very, very much. Good night.